Now it is my privilege to turn the stage over to our moderator for today's Education Leaders Roundtable. Errol Lewis is the host of Inside City Hall on New York One News, Time Warner Cable's 24-hour news channel in New York City. Errol?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning. A pleasure to be here. I was telling some of your folks earlier today that because I grew up in New Rochelle, I had a special appreciation of school boards when I was growing up. The mayor was part-time, the city council was very part-time. The superintendent seemed to be in charge of the town, as far as I could tell, at age 7. And indeed, as I grew up, I was told that that was true for a number of reasons. We're going to talk for about an hour. And this is, because the topics are so important and the time is so short, this is going to be kind of dancing across the treetops, is how Tim Kramer put it to me. That we'll touch on some of these topics and talk about them in a way that gives you a sense of what some of the thinking of some of these educational leaders is. I've got some questions. If I'm asking questions that sound like I'm challenging people, it's really just trying to explore some of the issues. And we have a great panel here for you to hear from. Starting from the far end and coming across, we have Paul Revel of the Harvard School of Education, who has a ton of information and perspective that is both national and related to his work in Massachusetts. Next to him, of course, is our superintendent, or I should say our education commissioner, John King. Good to see you. The great Chancellor Merrill Tisch is here with us. Chancellor Carmen Farina, also here. Wonderful talking with you a little earlier. And the Executive Director of NISBA, Timothy Kramer. And without further ado, and oh yes, please. And without further ado, and this is not a shy and retiring group of people. If you hear something that needs amending, rebutting, or extending, just jump right in. But I want to start with you, Tim, and let's talk about the Common Core. In the course of talking about it, reporting on it, reading about it, trying to understand it, my sense is that there's a lot of misinformation out there, that there are some contending views about it, and that's fine, but that some of it is based on maybe a misimpression of what Common Core is or is not. What are some of the things that you think people need to recognize about what these standards can do for New York?
Well, first of all, Common Core is not... Oh, I'm sorry.
Please. Perfect example. Perfect example. Tim,
I thought he said you.
Tim, of course, is a gracious host.
Sorry, go ahead.
Tim's a gracious host, which is why I kind of threw him the first question. But now that the cat's out the bag,
I kind of like your answer.
Now that the cat's out the bag, go right ahead.
Well, first of all, I think there's a misconception that Common Core is a curriculum, and it's not. It's a series of skills and strategies that I think we actually need for the workforce of tomorrow. And I think maybe when it was rolled out a little bit too, not necessarily quickly, but without that explanation. So I know here in New York City, we are spending a lot of time doing workshops and open meetings about what it is. I think that the skills that Common Core encourages, analytical thinking, speaking before an audience, working in collaborative groups, having an opinion but being able to back it by evidence, are all things that you're going to need in the workforce of tomorrow, because it's going to be a very competitive workforce. I think also reading a lot more nonfiction books, which is something that we didn't necessarily have in our curriculum, and how you extrapolate information from nonfiction is important. So I think it's really a matter of re-education, and this is one of the reasons why we worked very hard with our teachers union to increase our professional learning time to 80 minutes per week in every single school in New York City. And I think that's going to get us on the right track, including a lot more workshops for parents on what it is and what it isn't.
Well, I can tell you, we had our business meeting yesterday, and all the questions have been answered. It's crystal clear to me now.
Clear that all up, right?
We did have, definitely in the room yesterday, was a lot of discussion about Common Core, things related to that, such as standardized testing, annual professional performance reviews using student performance data. And there was indeed an element of pushback, perhaps a rethinking. We had a resolution that would suggest that we continue to use student performance data in teacher evaluations related to Common Core, and that was defeated. And so that repositions our organization a little bit as to how we feel about some of these things. So we are going to look for evidence of how the Common Core, the things associated with testing, the things associated with this new way of evaluating teachers, how that is actually working, and are there results that can prove the value of where the direction we've been going. But I would tell you that as an organization of leaders, we support high standards. Everybody in this room does. We want to make sure our kids graduate college and career ready.
Is the problem, Commissioner, that we're asking too much of these standards, that it's intending to do some of the things that the Chancellor was just talking about, but then if you take an additional step and try to integrate it into teacher evaluations, it can't support sort of the weight of doing all of those things?
Well, I think part of what's happened over the last couple of years is you had lots of initiatives going on at the same time, and I think that has conflated those initiatives in the public mind. So when people hear Common Core, they're thinking about standards, but they're also thinking about curriculum, they're thinking about teacher evaluation, they're thinking about the tax cap and budget constraints. It's all been conflated together. I think part of our work as leaders is to make sure that we focus on what the standards actually require, exactly the points that Chancellor Farina made, what the promise of the standards could be, and that we take every opportunity to provide professional development and support for teachers and principals so that they can help students meet the higher standards. Mm.
And Professor Revel, I heard, I mean, one of the critiques I heard of Common Core as it was being rolled out was that it wasn't sufficiently field tested, that it wasn't, that it was kind of adopted at a pace and at a speed that makes it uncertain whether or not it can accomplish the goals that it intends. What's your sense of that?
Well, let me first add to my introduction to say that I'm not a complete egghead from Harvard. I was Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, chairman of the board there, and a teacher and a principal at the same time in my background. So when I speak about these things, I speak from that perspective. I think that I'm not exactly sure what a set of goals that has been field tested looks like. I think there's a lot of confusion in the discussion about the Common Core. The Common Core, as the Chancellor said, is not a curriculum. It's a set of goals. It's a set of targets that we aim at. In New York, you already had fairly high standards. These are a little bit higher and a little bit different. But in the end, they're all about being goals, and goals are simply targets. What I worry about is in this cacophony that has surrounded the whole discussion about Common Core, we lose sight of the strategies that are needed to educate children at higher levels. If we had problems before, and New York and Massachusetts already had among the highest standards in the nation, if we had problems before with achievement gaps, with getting all of our students to proficiency, we will have an even deeper gap to contend with as we accept these new standards, which I believe are the right thing to do. I mean, we're simply doing as a nation what each of us did as individual states, to say that it doesn't make sense to have some communities in our state with no standards and others with very high. And so as a nation, we've said it doesn't make sense to have some states with very low and others with very high. Let's have a uniform common standard, but let's not mistake the goals for the strategies to get there. You don't fatten a cow by weighing it. You need strategies to grow the cow, and we need strategies to close achievement gaps.
I like that. You don't fatten a cow by... I could even use that in New York City. Well, a week from today, there's going to be an election here in New York. And when voters go in the booth, one of the ballot lines is called Stop Common Core. How did it get to be, these are mostly elected officials here, how did this get to be so politicized, and how do we, or is there a need to dial it back?
I think part of what happened nationally is that the Common Core got positioned in a partisan way, partly based on the misinformation that you described earlier, where there was the impression that the Common Core is being imposed by the federal government, and that has been used by politicians in some states to try to attack the Common Core as an extension of the Obama administration or as a federal imposition on local control, when in fact the Common Core began as a state effort, states coming together and saying, as Secretary Errol suggested, states coming together and saying, we've got to have a common set of high aspirations. Fractions don't look different in Mississippi than they look in New York. We've got to have a common set of high expectations for our country that we can all work towards.
But I mean, but you know, imposition is maybe not the right word, but aren't there funding streams that are tied to whether or not you implement Common Core? I mean, it's not something you can opt out of without significant financial costs as a state, right?
Well, what the federal government asks is for states to adopt college and career-ready standards. Now, there are states that have similarly high standards that are not the Common Core that would have met that threshold. Mm-hmm. But what you had was more than 40 states coming together and saying, we want to be a part of this common standards. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And Merrill Tish, I mean, when people do talk about it, they are often referring to the test, and it's sort of they're, as the chancellor said, conflating the goal with the means to get to the goal. On the other hand, there is this question of opting out of tests. Is that a helpful or a useful conversation, or is that just an argument that has to be kind of fought out at the local level?
You know, we watched the opt-out movement around the state. And I have to say, when I go to districts and I meet with parents and teachers, principals, superintendents, I really find the difference between the beginning of this rollout 18 months ago and now. I find that schools are, principals and parents are much more focused on getting the work done. And so, you know, I'm consistent. Whenever a parent says to me, should I opt my child out of a test, I said, well, it depends upon how you see the test. We see the test as one of the tools that we use in order to create an environment in schools that not only are there for the accountability of the overall school district, but to tell us what's going on in that classroom with each kid. What do we have to do in terms of professional development to make sure that the standards and benchmarks are going to be met? And so I never have seen tests as a punitive tool. I see them as a way to inform instruction and a way to inform best practice. As a matter of fact, when New York State went about designing its evaluation system, we were very clear to define it as a multi-measured system. Leaving out of 100 points, we left 60 points to the principals and teachers to work out how they would design it. We left 20 points up to local assessment, and we took a very narrow band for state assessment, which is just 20 points. As to the politicization of all of this, I think it was the perfect storm. It was tying standards, new standards, to new tests, to a new evaluation system, and then having it come down as, well, you will not get your state aid unless you have an evaluation system in place. You know, along the way, the roadmap to good intentions, and we've all had things where our very good intentions really dominate where you're going. You know, if you could redo or rethink some things, I've often said that if we could, John and I could have redone something, we would have engaged with parents much more because we had a story to tell about why we were doing it, and we didn't do that all that well. I'm sure the legislature made its share, the governor's office made its share, but this is all about, as Chancellor Farina said, this is all about good outcomes for students, our kids, our state, making it competitive and preparing it to enter into a 21st century workforce.
To the many delegates and board members here who are going to have to try and continue this conversation back home, when would be a good time to sort of check in and test the extent to which these new standards and the strategies for reaching them are sort of taking hold?
Well, I'd say we're seeing the gains already, even from the first year of the Common Core assessments in 2013 to the second year in 2014. We saw significant gains in math really throughout the state in every category of district. In English language arts, the performance was flatter. Some places saw gains, others less so. That was in just our first year of being able to see growth on assessments. I expect to see incremental growth again this year. Next year, the SAT will change to reflect the Common Core for the first time. Our students in New York will be that much better prepared for having had the benefit of the Common Core over the last few years. We expect, when we look at our NAEP assessment results, the gold standard for evaluating performance across states, we expect to see progress. We certainly are seeing progress in graduation rates because of the work of folks in this room. Chancellor and I have spent the first few months of the school year visiting school districts all over the state, seeing the progress from East Meadow to Newburgh to Niagara Falls.
John, there's a room full of school districts.
I know, I won't
How are
get
you
to all
gonna
of
get
them.
But again, the progress here will not be a function of the test. The tests simply measure the progress, or only indirectly of the goals, the target that you're aiming for, because you already had high goals. But the progress will be a reflection of the kinds of strategies in which teachers and children and curriculum have engaged in the classroom. And that will be the measure of the progress, is how we do the work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also think that we have to get away from the notion that because something is hard, it's wrong. And we have to understand that because it's hard is because we're falling behind in many different ways. And if you look at the rest, let's just look at some countries in
I love
Europe.
this lady.
No, because we want to be like Finland, we want to be like Japan, and yet we don't want to do the hard work that's associated with it. So I think we've really got to look at it okay. But I do believe that we have to, and I do think professional development is the piece that gets you there. A lot more training for teachers.
Errol, one of the things that I've been told by a lot of the people in this audience is it's not all a quantitative measure of the results. There's a big qualitative measure here as well, and the conversations are different now. We're talking about student achievement. We're talking about those strategies far more often. This annual professional performance review is, for all the griping that's gone on around that, and it has not been successful in a lot of different measures. But I've been told by even people who are on the teacher side who said, you know what, we're actually having much better conversations about students, about results, about strategies, about outcomes than we ever had before. It's far more, I think it's been it's forced an engagement around students that we just have not had in the past.
Okay, let me shift to a different topic that often comes up right behind the conversations about Common Core, and that's this issue about whether or not there is some grand conspiracy in the direction of privatization that lies behind a lot of the reform movement. The notion, of course, that that there are private firms out there that want to just do data mining, that want to get big contracts, that this is driving policy in a way that is wrong, or at least questionable, or should be challenged. It's a tough question if you're only thinking about education, but here again, these folks have to go back and sort of make budgets and fight through budgets and explain to people that just because they hired a data company to help with what they're doing doesn't mean that they're going to give away a lot of data that can later be sold or resold. How do you sort of, it's one of these kind of subterranean conversations that would probably be better addressed up front. And I usually hear it only from critics. I'm wondering if some of you could talk about what's actually going on, what's not going on, how to get better control of that whole conversation.
I just, from the standpoint of somebody who's participated in education reform discussions in the nation's leading student achievement state, Massachusetts, for 25 years, and around the nation in a variety of jurisdictions, I see very little evidence of this conspiracy theory that you cite. To be sure, there are people in the space who have interest and financial interest. It's up to those of us who have governance responsibilities to mind those, to control those, and keep those out of the work. But overall, what I see is a very well-intentioned conspiracy among reformers to do a better job of teaching our students so that they can learn up to the levels that will enable them to be successful. It's very difficult to prove the negative. So when these charges start being flung around by various sources, it's difficult to say, well, it isn't there. But all I can tell you is from my experience, I don't see this vast conspiracy. To be sure, there are people with financial interests. There are testing companies, there are curriculum companies, there are all kinds of people in the business. But they were in the business anyway. When all of us, for example, just had our own state standards and our own tests, and we're doing our own thing about all this, that was the case as well. We have responsibilities, those of us in positions of governance, to monitor conflict of interest. And I think if we execute those responsibilities, this wouldn't be a problem.
Is this Tim? Is this sort of as he suggests, sort of a permanent issue? You know, you always had to buy textbooks. You always had to sort of get the superintendent's contract and,
well,
and
as
the
a
other
matter,
supplies.
as a matter of fact, when the Common Core came about, there was at least a discussion about the potential efficiencies here. That actually there would be testing would not be having to be created at the local level. That a lot of the curriculum would be that you could get online would be available statewide, and you wouldn't have to be recreating a lot of the strategies that we've been talking about. So at one point in time, at least, it was viewed as a way in which we could save money, cut costs, but it has been described as being some corporate takeover of public education. All I know, and I'm not the person who is a psychometrician or a textbook expert or anything like that, I've read the standards. A lot of people have not read these standards. I've read these standards, I looked at them, I thought these are reasonable statements of what I would hope children would be able to know and do at certain levels within their educational career. Testing for that, teaching to those standards, I'm not the expert on that, but the standards themselves look reasonable.
I'll tell you, I mean, after 30 years in the journalism business, I can tell you if you're spending $57 billion a year, as these folks are, somebody's going to try and get their hands on it, right? Oh, yeah. And which is fine. You know, we understand that's how it all works. But is this sort of a byproduct of some of the prominent reformers being corporate leaders, being sort of part of hedge funds and other sort of aggressively public?
One of the things that has been surprising to me, and I was just recently in Seattle, and I visited the Gates Foundation's showroom there, where they describe all of their philanthropic projects that they're doing around the world. And I come back here, and we just get told that Bill Gates is the devil incarnate. And I just never understood how his brand became so evil. But it has happened, and maybe I'm missing something.
You know, on the one hand, we in education have benefited enormously from the attention that corporate America has paid to schools. At the level of corporate America at some point after the Nation at Risk report saying it's no longer just an ancillary department of municipal government, a school system. It's important to the economic development of our communities, of our states, of our regions, of our nation. And it's our human capital development system, and we need to invest in that system, strengthen that system, and bring it from an early 20th century model into a 21st century model where it prepares not just some students for 21st century employment, but all students for 21st century employment. And so I think we would not have gotten in Massachusetts at least the kind of funding that we've been able to get for public education if the corporate community had not said to the governor and the legislature, this is in our self-interest. Yes. And so absolutely. I think on the one hand, we have to welcome that and support that. On the other hand, we've got to prevent and protect against conflicts of interest.
In the long run, the best thing we can do for public education, for resources at the local level, is to grow the economic base. Right? What's going to result in stronger, easier school budgets is if we have more folks who are earning well because there's job growth and economic development in the region. And we see that in regions of the state where there's strong economic growth, it's reflected in the resources that are available to schools. And the reverse is also true. In regions of the state where economic growth has been stymied, there aren't the resources there to maintain the kinds of programs we want. If more students graduate ready for college and careers, if more students graduate ready to go into nanotech in the capital region or any of the growing industries that we have around the state, if they're more prepared, that will then ultimately benefit our school districts.
I think it's also important to note that some involvement is crucial if we're going to succeed as a public school system. And I think that the announcement last week on CTE, Career and Technology Engineering Schools, is really important because we need CEOs to adopt schools that are going to produce students that are going to work in their businesses. And I think, for example, in New York City, we have gotten a lot of companies investing in us, in specific schools, because that's the workforce of tomorrow. We want to see more internships, more mentorships starting in middle school, not just in high school. And we want these CEOs to also provide people in their companies to be in our schools, because a lot of criticism of public education is from people who've never crossed the threshold of a public school. And we need to have the business community come into our public schools. We need to have everybody coming in. And I always want to say, when someone criticizes something, I say, when was the last time you ever walked into a classroom? Because people who walk into classrooms see something very different than people who criticize from afar. So I do think some involvement is crucial. It's the right kind, and how much.
You know, Chancellor, that strikes me. I'm thinking back in the 1980s. I remember writing stories about the Boston Compact. Mm-hmm. Kevin White was the mayor at the time, and Boston Corporation said, "Enough of these troubled schools. We're going to get involved." And then, you know, I got out of college and I came down here, and there was the Newark collaboration, and the big Prudential and the big corporate interests said, "We're gonna get involved in the Newark schools." I mean, this strikes me as a kind of maybe a permanent kind of a challenge that this particular segment of our community that needs to support public education just kind of doesn't get it, or needs to sort of always renew these connections and try to rebuild them. Are we just talking past each other?
I think that the word partnership comes to mind. And when you have a partnership, it's who sets the agenda and who cooperates. And I think you need to have a collaborative effort on this. But I do think there's a difference when educators get to sit at the table, because in a lot of the major movements, it's where business made the decisions all by themselves. And I think, having spent 49 years in education, and I was a superintendent to the school board, with the school board president who's now mayor, so I know how those relationships work. And I think, how do you create the partnership, and what's the right role for everyone to play in that partnership?
Mm-hmm.
I think, since we're at a conference of school boards, there's an enormous role for school boards in mediating that relationship between the community and the school system, making those boundaries porous, ensuring that business people actually get into schools and walk in the shoes of a principal for a day, for example, and see what the challenges are. I mean, there's a lot of research that shows the closer you are to day-to-day experience of a school system, the more favorable your opinion is going to be on public education. Mm-hmm. And I think school boards have an enormous role to play in bringing their communities into schools.
Okay, something for everyone to take home with them. There's a pressing topic. It's not affecting every section of the state equally, but thousands of unaccompanied minors have been crossing the border. Many of them are ending up in New York. What are the challenges, and how do we meet them as far as the resources and the guidance and the policies that are going to be needed at the local level?
So I'm really happy that this came up. I went to a couple of districts out on Long Island last week where they are seeing quite a number of these students appearing on their doorsteps and in their communities. And first of all, let me say, I come from a family of immigrants, so I am particularly sensitive to this issue. English was not the language spoken in my home when I was growing up. And quite honestly, to this day, even when I sit here, I translate in my head, does the adverb come before the verb and the adjective, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the promise of America, is how we embrace our immigrant communities on whose shoulders we have built our greatness. These are the people who have come to our shores year after year, decade after decade. And so I think it's going to be a challenge for us with this particular group of students, because many of them have come from circumstances that really would really make your hair turn white if we let it go white. But I do want to say they are ending up in communities that already have enormous challenges. I think of Roosevelt, I think of Wyandanch, I think of Hempstead. These are communities, these are school districts that have been formulated for whatever reason, with a very nondescript tax base, and I'm being very generous, to support the education of their students within their community, and now they are being asked to take on yet another challenge. And so I believe, in a minute John is going to describe what we're doing legally, but educationally at Roosevelt, I will tell you, every child that I saw was placed in a school, in a district, in proper instructional settings. In Hempstead, the middle school and elementary school, youngsters have been placed. The high school students, 150 of them, are in a transitional space as they await placement into the high schools. But it is naive for us to think that school districts already challenged financially are going to be able to manage the resource and capacity issues of these students. We will need some sort of federal and statewide financial addressing of these issues, because these communities will be forced to erupt rather than to embrace these students within their districts. And I think, John, you should talk about what we've done legally.
Sure. So a couple things. One is the challenge here goes beyond just the unaccompanied minors. We have significant numbers of undocumented students who are coming with their families, and we have a significant influx of immigrant students in communities around the state. One thing that is clear is all school districts have an obligation to serve the students who live in that district, regardless of immigration status. And that is a fundamental civil rights issue, and certainly we are working with the Attorney General to ensure that we enforce that civil right throughout the state. That said, resources are critical. We are supporting an effort at the federal level to try to get the federal government to put resources towards particularly the unaccompanied minors. At the state level, we have a broader problem that the state aid formula reflects lagged enrollment. And so one of the things that the Regents discussed at the last Regents meeting is in our state aid proposal, asking the state to change the approach on enrollment so that districts that have a large influx of students have that reflected in their state aid. We've also talked about the need for an immediate infusion of resources for these communities this school year to address the influx of students.
Errol, I'm proud to announce that as of yesterday at a business meeting, we had a late resolution came in, and you have to go through some hoops to get that late resolution introduced. It was properly introduced, and it was passed, and it called for, and I'm very proud of the people that were there, it called for us to support additional resources and funding for these unaccompanied minors.
Was this a question of maybe the need being greater than was anticipated, or was there just an assumption that it would be absorbed at the local level?
I think the federal government underestimated the number of unaccompanied minors that would come. I also think the concentration of new arrivals, again, whether they're unaccompanied or coming with families, the concentration of new arrivals in particular communities where they already have family and friends, where they've settled. I think that was underestimated by the federal government. The challenge for us in New York is they're now here, they're ours. We've got to educate them, and whether the federal government acts or not, as a state, we've got to act.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about people who walked across the border and then suddenly ended up in Roosevelt or something. They have to have family members here, and
it's a combination. So some are placed by the court system. Some are coming to join family members who are already here.
And I think the other challenge beyond money, although money is obviously an issue, is do you have the right programs in your existing areas to support these kids? So, for example, in New York City, we have put this all under our English language learner executive director and making sure that there are specific programs. For example, the international high schools do a particularly good job, and they've taken the bulk of our kids who come in high school age. But what are we doing for kids who come in middle school? So we have to start developing programs where it's easy for a transitional period at least to be able to say these students are not just in a school or in a seat, but they're getting the education they need to move on to something else. And that's a challenge, but I do think that that's something that larger cities can meet more easily, but smaller areas are going to have a much harder time.
I also think that I haven't spoken to John about this, but for accountability purposes, what can we do at a state level to hold schools and school districts harmless for how these students are performing in their school districts? Last year we asked the... last year, we asked the federal government for 2 waivers. One waiver was the year in which we test newly arrived students as part of the accountability system. Right now, you have to test them in the 2nd year for the purpose of accountability. And the second waiver we asked for are our students with special needs. You know, how we test them, et cetera, et cetera. Those waivers are being considered. John gets angry because I think they were kind of rejected and now they're being considered, but John assures me they're being considered. So, but I want to say it will just add to the burden that districts are feeling right now. If these students, where their nature would be to embrace them and welcome them to their community, if they become part of a larger set of existing problems, it's not going to work. So there are things that we can do to address this. There are things that we need the federal government to help us with. And then, quite frankly, as with everything, it is how in your communities, all of you as leaders in the communities which have these students, it's the language you use around them and their arrival that will really set the tone.
And this is not, I mean, as near as I can tell, looking at the political side of it, this is not going to get resolved in, 24 or 36 months. In effect, these are going to be, for all intents and purposes, a permanent part of whatever district the kids land up in. Will there need to be sort of waivers year after year after year, or at what point do you sort of fully integrate?
Well, I think the question of the waivers is really one where we need to persuade the Department of Education that we're going to ensure that students are getting, to Chancellor Frenia's point, a quality education. Their fear is that if there is no accountability mechanism, and they have examples of this from around the country, districts that warehouse students rather than educating students. And so the balance we've got to strike, and we're negotiating with them on this, is how do we ensure that we're not penalizing the districts that have welcomed new students, but at the same time that we're ensuring that we are all working towards the academic progress of those students, because you're right, they're here. And not only are they here in our K-12 system, we want them to have access to higher education to ultimately be prepared to contribute to society, because they are a part of our community now.
Yeah, you look at what it takes to get an asylum claim processed, and it becomes clear they're not leaving anytime soon.
Just one comment from an outside perspective. I do think we're struggling with the same issue in Massachusetts. I think the first order priority is this matter of financing. The finance system has to be more nimble than it currently is at both the state and the federal level. And again, legislators need to hear from constituents, and school boards are ideally positioned to put the heat on legislators to say, this is an immediate problem and it's a disproportionate impact here. And so we've got to develop some facility in that system to respond to that. And then secondly, once we get adequate resources with which to provide programs to serve the needs of these children, then we have to think about the impact on the accountability system.
You also can't dump the whole problem on the school system. Right. In other words, these kids are there for 8 hours a day. This is going to require an enormous collaboration between the social service network and the school district and the health department to manage this. And so there needs to be a convening around this sooner rather than later.
Okay, let's talk about charter schools. Let's not. Yeah, okay. I understand that sentiment. On the other hand, there's a specific issue. Not to sort of rehash all of the old battles, but there's a new rule in New York that was inspired by the governor, in which the property rental and acquisition, well, not never acquisition, but the cost sharing around whether or not you do a co-location has been altered in a way that makes clear that the school system is going to have to pay if they can't make a co-location work. That has created a whole set of challenges for Chancellor Farina that I'd love to hear an update on if you'd like. But there's also a concern that this is going to become the norm statewide, and I'd like to sort of hear where people think this conversation is going.
Let me start, because I have been a loud advocate for charter schools in large urban settings. I believe that in a district, and I'll just speak about New York City right now because we find ourselves in New York City and they have the largest conglomerate of charter school residents in the city. I think that the choice it's an important tool. I don't think it should be the only choice. I think we should be looking to promote the role of parochial schools and charter schools. I think we should be looking to promote alternative types of schools. But I do want to say that charter schools started. They have a large footprint in New York City. They do not have a footprint as you get out of New York City. I mean, if you live in a district outside of New York City, where most of you do, I would say, you know, we're talking about a handful of charter schools in very specific places, with the exception of Albany, which has, yeah. So the challenge is going to be what's going to happen going forward for the rest of the state, because we have 100 charters to give out upstate that no one seems to really be applying for. So I understand it's not popular in districts, but I do want to say that I think there is a way for charter schools and the rest of the school system to cohabit well together. But to remove charter schools as an option, I think would be a mistake. I don't think charter schools are the panacea that everyone keeps writing about, that they're the greatest thing since sliced bread, but I do believe in choice, and I believe in giving parents choice after decades of sending family members to the same failing schools.
And the thing I would just add to that, you know, last year in New York, fewer than 20 out of every 100 African American or Latino students who started ninth grade graduated college ready after 4 years of high school. Fewer than 20 out of 100. That's 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education. I am much less focused on the governance questions and more focused on the outcomes question. Charters should be, from my perspective, a part of the array of options that we make available, but we have to have, as a society, a tremendous sense of urgency about creating more seats in good schools. And to the extent that charters are a part of that solution, great. Where they're not, they should be closed. And where district schools are a part of that solution, great. I know Chancellor Freeney is working very hard to try to ensure that whether kids go to a charter in the city or a district school in the city, they're going to get the best possible education. And that's what we're all committed to.
And in New York City, I really look at it, what's best for the kids, and are the kids being well served. Having said that, we invite the charter schools to attend our professional development. We started something called Learning Partners, where we learn for each other. But keeping in mind that charter schools' original purpose was to share innovative practices, we also need them to come to the table and tell us what they're doing that's bringing everything up to a certain level. And also, honestly...
And actually, they should open their books and show us where their resources are coming and how their resources are being spent. They should. Transparency is great for you guys. It should be great for everyone.
That should be part of state regulation,
exactly.
I assume it is.
No, it's not, honey.
Should be.
No, it's not. Should be.
And it's about equity also. It's not just, you know, is everyone serving the same kids in all kinds of schools? And I visit charter schools all the time, and I'm impressed by those that are doing some fabulous stuff, particularly with kids with autism and other special needs. But you need to do your fair share of working with English language learners and special needs kids.
How were the co-locations going, Chancellor?
Actually, we've done a lot more work. We created something called campus squads, which if there are issues in a school, we actually send neutral parties to go in and make some decisions, which I think has actually worked beautifully. But the other thing, we've tried to get it to work better also by putting our arts grants and other grants where they have to apply together. So if you want to share an arts teacher, music teacher, we've actually very clearly spelled out what they need to do, but they have to apply as a group. And I also visit co-located schools that have done other things, like one of the CTE campuses is sharing teachers. We also know that because of the small school movement, that many schools do not have enough monies to share, for example, AP courses. So we've asked schools to share AP teachers across a campus. So people who learn how to share and be collaborative get extra points and extra support. And those who still think they're in a competitive mode, not so much.
Very good. Very good.
One comment I'd make about charter schools is just that Governor Patrick and I used to say it shouldn't be about a battle between mainstream schools and charter schools. It should be a question of seeking out good practices and good schools, and then shame on us if we don't do everything we can to imitate those. In Massachusetts and Boston in particular, we have some of the nation's top performing charter schools. We also in Massachusetts have some very poor performing charter schools, and we make it our business as State Board of Education to close those schools. So I find it impossible to generalize about charter schools except to say that these are alternative approaches to education. They generally have more autonomy, and looking at what they've done with that autonomy, we can learn some lessons, pro and con, about things that we may or may not be able to do within mainstream schools, including giving some of our schools the kinds of autonomies that we've heretofore only afforded to charter schools.
And actually, in New York City, with this contract, we have something called PROS, which are schools coming together either individually as a group to ask for waivers for any number of things. And it was amazing to me the kinds of things that regular public schools have asked for, and with the consent of the state, and we thank you, John and Errol, we expect to have about 200 schools that are going to experiment within the public school setting for all kinds of things, and we'll be monitoring that.
Well, just briefly, what was the experience in Massachusetts as far as best practices that originate, say, in the charter sector being replicated or spread throughout the system?
Well, we've got a very strong collaborative going now in Boston, and Superintendent Carol Johnson in her time was very active in putting that together, and some of the charter school leadership brought that together. I always thought, frankly, from my perspective, that the claims made in that regard were a little bit exaggerated. Charter schools were brand new on the scene. And in the early stages, they had neither the arrogance nor the experience to claim that they had things to teach to mainstream schools who had been in this decade for centuries. So I think it would take a little time. Second, it would take a willing audience. In many of our communities in Massachusetts, the mainstream school system was frankly hostile to the charter schools. So there was no audience in the mainstream school system for practices that charter schools had pioneered and found successful. I think we've gotten over some of that early hostility and that warfare that's going on, and there is now a coming to the table and a realization that really the coin of the realm is student achievement. And anybody that's engaged in effective practice to advance student learning deserves some attention, and mainstream schools as well as charter schools are paying attention to what they have to learn from one another.
Can I just add something to that? I don't know how popular it's going to be in this room. I think the one thing that charter schools, the ones that are successful, that I've noticed that I would want to replicate for public schools, we know that time on task is a very important part of student achievement and professional development. Charter schools, because of the autonomy that they have, tend to have longer school days and longer school years. That means in some schools, in some charter schools, they are getting up to 3 or 4 hours of instruction more every week than you're seeing in our regular public school system. I think what we've learned more than anything as we've adopted these higher standards is that our kids can achieve given the right circumstances and the right settings. And when school bells across this state ring at 2:40, and I see kids in our districts getting on school buses to go home, to sit in front of the TV, rather than being in a school setting where they can be doing so many wonderful things, including arts, music, and physical education, I say until we as a state understand longer school day, longer school year, we are shortchanging our students.
Okay, in our last 5 minutes, I've been given the warning, and I think we're standing between these folks and lunch. So, in our last 5 minutes, we have had a robust conversation in New York City about universal pre-kindergarten. Chancellor Farini was telling me before the panel about how well it's going. I know that there are some funding issues about it that I'd like the panel to maybe touch on. That New York City got everything, or virtually everything, that it wanted in order to launch this. But what are the prospects for this, without waiting for any results from New York City, to become a sort of statewide policy, a statewide commitment, and where would the money for that come from?
Yeah, so the Board of Regents has long advocated for truly universal pre-K. We call it universal pre-K, but it's actually not universal. Last year was an important investment. The $340 million additional dollars for pre-K was a good down payment. We have a long way to go to get to where pre-K can be universal. The regents in their state aid proposal will propose significant additional resources for pre-K, particularly to try to achieve more rapid expansion outside of New York City. Because what we saw last year was 300 of the 340 came to New York City and only 40 million was available rest of state. The other challenge, two other challenges, the 40 was distributed in a competitive way. We also have a $25 million fund that was competitive, and so one of the challenges is if we believe pre-K should be universal, we shouldn't be competing for it, we should have it. But the other issue is that districts were expected to forward fund rather than getting immediate reimbursement for the pre-K expenditures. That is something, given the influx of lawsuit settlements that the state has experienced, hopefully there'll be an opportunity to address that as well.
Where do you think the number will come in?
I learned last year from the budget process not to answer that kind of
Had to ask. I had to ask.
But I am optimistic.
Yeah.
Well, let me try a different angle on the same question, which is, will the property tax caps that local districts have to sort of contend with make it tougher to do that? Or are you going to expect the legislature to sort of just write the check?
Answer, yes. This tax cap is something that everybody in this room has to deal with, and it is very, very difficult to invest in some of these things like universal pre-K that we fully support. But we have made dramatic cuts through kindergarten through 12th grade, what is our mandate. And now you're saying, but put your money into UPK. We don't even sure that kindergarten's not even full day in some instances. And we would love to fund UPK. We'd love to do it in a sustainable, regular approach, but we also have to have the funding available to us for our full mandate. And if the state aid's there, that's helpful. But putting a limit onto what we can raise locally, or at least realistically, has made it very, very difficult for these people to make that kind of an investment.
Okay, that is going to be the last word. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you. Thank you.